welcome everyone. Thank you. Thank you for attending our education book discussion today with Professor Cary Nelson. I'm Jenna Robinson, president of the James G. Martin Center for Academic Renewal. The Martin Center is a nonprofit organization dedicated to higher education reform. We advocate responsible governance, viewpoint diversity, academic quality, cost-effective education solutions, and innovative market reform. You can find out more at jamesgmartin.center. The Martin Center's education book discussions are quarterly online events with authors of recent or sort of recent books about higher education or related topics. Thank you to our viewers and donors for making events like this possible. Although this event is free, we appreciate those of you who have made voluntary contributions. Your support fuels absolutely everything we do, and we're very grateful. I'll hand the floor over to Professor Nelson shortly, but I want to take 1 minute to just tell you all how this event will run. First, Professor Nelson will talk for about 20 minutes about his book. Then he and my colleague George Leaf will have a short discussion. And at around 3:15, George will start posing questions from the audience. Viewers, you can post a question by using the Q&A icon at the bottom of your Zoom screen at any time. And viewers on Facebook, simply post your questions in the comment section and we'll be sure to monitor those as well. Also, we are recording this event so you can watch it later or share it online. We'll be sure to send you the link as soon as the video is posted. Again, thank you for being here and supporting our work. We hope to see some of you at our next book talk event, which will be in the first quarter of 2025. And stay tuned for an announcement about who we'll be talking to. So today, the book we're talking about is Hate Speech and Academic Freedom, the Anti-Semitic Assault on Basic Principles, which was published in April 2024. The book was actually completed shortly before Hamas carried out its October 7th terrorist attack, but it has proved prescient. Hate speech and academic freedom takes up issues that have consequently gained new urgency in the academy worldwide. It is the first book to ask what impact anti-Semitism has had on the fundamental principles the academy relies on for its identity: academic freedom, free speech rights, standards for hiring or firing faculty members and administrators, and the ethics of academic content and debate. Anti-Semitic hatred is spreading at fever pitch. What steps can counter it? What damage to students is done when departments embrace anti-Zionism? Should faculty members face consequences for promoting anti-Semitism on social media? Should universities make a new push to adopt the definition of anti-Semitism put forward by the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance? These are important questions, and I look forward to hearing discussed. The author, who we're delighted to welcome today, is Cary Nelson, a professor emeritus of English at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, where he has taught since 1970. Nelson has authored over 30 books and 300 essays. Nelson served as president of the American Association of University Professors from 2006 to 2012. He received his BA from Antioch College in 1967 and PhD from the University of Rochester in 1970. Professor Nelson, the floor is yours.
Well, thanks a lot, Jenna, and thanks so much to George and the Martin Center for making this possible, and also to George for writing a great review of Hate Speech and Academic Freedom, which I was really excited to receive and to send around on listservs and to friends. So I thought I'd try to talk a little bit to bridge my April 2024 book, Hate Speech and Academic Freedom, and also some of my thinking in my current book manuscript, which I'm now in the process of concluding, which is about reactions to October 7th, to the Hamas massacre on October 7th, 2023. And it's about reactions outside Israel. I'm not going to claim to speak for Israelis, but reactions in the West, both in North America and in Europe. When I was writing Hate Speech and Academic Freedom, I felt that it was going to be pretty difficult to get people to listen to the arguments that I was trying to make, because I was trying to really preserve the principle of academic freedom, but also maximize our awareness of the responsibilities that faculty members would undertake in terms of what they say in print, what they argue in class, and what they say on social media. And, I proposed some pretty uh, powerful interventions in the decision making that we make about consequences for faculty speech. And I thought, well, people aren't going to be ready to take this on. But then when 10/7 happened, and when aggressive faculty speech escalated, and you actually had faculty members endorsing a Hamas murderous assault, when you had faculty members expressing ecstasy about murder squads rampaging through what were basically rural communities on the border with Gaza, I thought, well, now people are going to feel they have to confront this. If they're looking at faculty members endorsing murder, rape, uh, kidnapping, they're going to wonder really whether does academic freedom cover that? Should there be consequences? And my conclusion is that it's still going to be pretty hard to get people to confront those hard decisions. I speak online with groups and I have a lot of conversations by Zoom with people around the world. And the people who sign on to those discussions are often willing to talk about it. But to have a debate on a campus is quite another matter, and that simply hasn't happened. The book the book itself really starts with trying to make it clear what the special faculty role is in promoting anti-Semitism. So I point out that it's either NGOs or academics who not only explain the claim that Israel is an apartheid state, but even say polemically that Israeli apartheid is worse than that long practiced in South Africa, which seems to me a fantasy accusation and fundamentally false. It's academics, amongst others, they're not the only ones, but they play a key role in shamelessly repeating the lie that Israel is actually the world's worst violator of human rights, ignoring or discounting the overwhelming human rights abuses by countries like China, Iran, Myanmar, North Korea, Russia, and Syria, amongst many others. I mean, it's really quite a rogues gallery of nation states that have no respect for human rights. Israel ain't at the top of them, no matter how you slice the cake. It's academia that has perhaps done more than any other constituency to keep alive the slander that Zionism is a form of racism. It's academics who write at length to sustain the anti-Semitic fiction of a vastly powerful Israeli lobby. It's academics who try to justify not just comparisons, but equivalences between Israel and Nazi Germany. And it's not academics who just don't post concise lines on lies on social media, but really write books and essays with elaborate anti-Semitic rationalizations. So some of these are really roles that are unique to the academy. I mean, the average member of Congress doesn't write serious treatises trying to prove that Israel is a violator of human rights. Academia is the source of complex rationales that underwrite anti-Semitism. And of course, as I try to explain to parents, faculty members are the ones that teach your children. Um, they're not irrelevant in the process of higher education. Strangely enough, that's a hard message to get across, particularly a hard message to get across to NGOs, non-governmental organizations that operate in this space. I mean, they're often very concerned about students They have programs in support of students, but they don't have programs that address the reality of the faculty role in promoting lies, spreading disinformation, and finally engaging in what amounts to indoctrination. Um, it was not until 2021 that we had academic departments coming out with formal statements in support of anti-Zionism or crossing the line into anti-Semitism. Prior to that, you had national disciplinary associations, the Women's Studies Association, the American Studies Association. They made statements like that, but academic departments hadn't done so. With the 2021 war in Hamas, academic departments began issuing official policy statements demonizing Israel. And that had a huge effect because it meant that faculty members who were inclined to teach in an indoctrinating fashion had not only, in some cases, disciplinary support for doing that, they now had their very own department telling them that's what you should do. And undergraduates felt much more free to voice those sentiments. And then what I think is not noticed, because after all, there's been a fair amount of publicity about faculty indoctrination, is what happens at large institutions like my own, Ohio State, University of California, Berkeley, long list of large institutions, institutions with 25,000, 30,000, 40,000, 50,000 students. Those large institutions, which, by the way, educate a large percentage, not only of the undergraduates, but especially a large percentage of Jewish students and other minority students in some cases, at those institutions, a lot of the undergraduate teaching isn't even done by faculty members. It's done by graduate assistants. And we're getting some pretty good demographic data, survey responses. Some folks at Brandeis did a really good, I thought, very blunt and targeted survey just a few months ago um, of 4,000 undergraduates in the country. And they asked them really blunt, forceful questions like, um, Jews only care about themselves, not about anyone else. Jews control the media. Um, and a series of about a dozen questions like that. The students could answer anonymously, so they were protected from disclosure. And then they tabulated what percentage of undergraduates agreed with these propositions and what percentage disagreed. Well, about 15 to 17% of American undergraduates agreed with the questions that demonized Israel. Another 15% agreed primarily with the questions that demonized Jews. And 2%, and that sounds trivial, agreed with every single proposition, every single hostile proposition. So let's say 2%. How many irredeemably hostile students to Jews in Israel, if Berkeley represents the average, would 2% represent? Well, that means there are 900 students on the Berkeley campus who are filled with hatred to both Jews and Israel. That means that on campuses with 50,000 students, more than a third, say 33%, either are irredeemably hostile to Jews or to Israel itself. That provides a huge cohort, and that's the cohort that supplied the encampments. So we estimate that typically only 10% of the student body was active in encampments. but 10% of Ohio State is 5,000 students. 10% of my own campus, the University of Illinois, is 4,500 students. So to produce a few hundred students on an encampment at any given time means the rest of them, thousands more, can just cycle through. So you have this really huge cohort involved with these terrible ideas, and they're being taught more than anything else by graduate assistants who are even more hostile and more vehement than the faculty members. And what I like to say is that the graduate students have the passions of undergraduates, but the authority of faculty members because they're in a classroom giving lectures, grading students. So I actually think when I give recommendations about the changes that need to be made now, I say that the first change that needs to be made is to fire those graduate students. They're not, they don't have tenure. They're not there for the lifetime, and they're actually having the most powerful effect on the largest number of undergraduate students. I think I think we need to make it clear to them that political indoctrination has no place in the classroom. They need to go through disciplinary proceedings, but the penalty should be dismissal. I think that's really a first step that we need to make. What can be done about anti-Semitic faculty? Well, I don't want, you know, a kangaroo court in permanent session surveilling faculty speech, but there are moments in time in a career when one can intervene. First of all, you do not have to hire a racist or an anti-Semite. You do not have to hire one. So job searches have to be principled and have to be morally grounded. Next point, you don't have to give tenure to a racist or an anti-Semite. That's a moment in time when you can intervene, when you can make a detailed judgment and you can exercise that judgment. You don't have to, I hope the dog isn't overwhelming this. Um, What I'm told is that she knows what she wants and she demands it until she gets it, but you don't necessarily know what it is she wants. That, alas, is the problem. So you don't have to approve a sabbatical application that's based on racist or anti-Semitic values. You don't have to give a salary raise. You can begin to to have consequences. So the principle that I outline in the book, which is, I think, a clear principle, but difficult to get people to understand, is this. Academic freedom gives you the right to say what you want. If you want to say that Jews have horns, if you want to say that Black people are inferior, fine, say it. But academic freedom does not protect you from the consequences, the professional consequences of saying it. If your speech as a faculty member affects your teaching, if it's demonstrated in your research, if it's present on social media, you can be held accountable for it, even though you have the right to say it. The idea that academic freedom protects speech, no matter what it is, simply makes no sense. And it especially makes no sense in a world where we know that even online speech that doesn't produce any violence in the United States can inspire violence elsewhere in the world. We need to think of faculty speech in terms of its international consequences. That's a much tougher assignment, but I think that's our professional responsibility to operate at that level. One major difference that really has cropped up in the last few months is that the organization in whose national elected leadership I served for a mere 23 years. The American Association of University Professors has gone back on its guiding principles and has become an organization that I loved for a big chunk, for a quarter of a century and more, is now an organization that has lost its way. It's no longer giving us good guidance on these issues. The work that it did for a century, beginning in 1915, I think for the next 100 years, or I might say for the next 99 years through 2014, I think is tremendously valuable and can still offer us guidance, but it doesn't deserve the honor that it's had in the present time. So I think the AUP has come under a lot of criticism in the last few months. I think that criticism is deserved. It's now just another political organization. It's now just a political advocacy organization instead of a neutral organization devoted to principle. That's a huge loss. Um, I don't think it's going to be easily reversible. One of the reasons that it's developed that way, and I'll take some responsibility for this, is its decision to move into collective bargaining, into being a union. I supported that decision. However, like everyone else who supported it, I didn't see what the consequences would be. And I think the worst consequence was that instead of running a meritocracy in which the leaders of the national organization were people with proven expertise in academic freedom and in the First Amendment, the leaders now were people who rose up through the union hierarchy, who were proven to be great labor organizers. And I'm sorry, being a labor organizer doesn't prepare you to make a policy statement about academic freedom. I mean, the two things are not the same. And that has distorted the leadership in general, and it's had a huge, terrible impact on what's called the Committee A on Academic Freedom and Tenure, which is the AAUP's main policy writing body. It used to have four or five lawyers, academic lawyers, on that committee who had national and international prestige, people who were recommended as potential Supreme Court members, people who had positions on international bodies, really respected First Amendment academic freedom experts. When my presidency ended, all of them were eliminated from the policymaking body. The policymaking body is now dominated by opponents of academic freedom and supporters of boycotts, academic boycotts of Israeli institutions. So the policymaking body, which is issuing this stuff, I mean, I'm sorry, it is just not the meritocracy that it used to be. Um, I mean, when I served on it, I was sort of thought of as a minor authority on academic freedom, although I had several books on the subject. But that didn't quite compare to these lawyers in their 60s who had been doing this work for decade after decade, and that has been um, a huge loss. Um, And I think I've now used up what is supposed to be my time. I prefer to give 4-hour lectures, very different from the ones that Donald Trump gives, but I'll defer to the process this time around. Again, thanks for listening.
Well, I'd like to pop in at this point and thank Cary Nelson, first of all, for having written a really strongly argued, fairly argued book. And when I read it, I thought this is something that the Martin Center needs to review. And I was delighted to set up this webinar. So thank you very much.
And thank you.
And I have a bunch of questions. Let's start with this one, a hypothetical. Suppose that a faculty member persistently introduces anti Semitic discussions into a course where such material is not germane. At what point, if any, would it be appropriate for school officials to threaten some sort of sanction? And if so, what might that sanction be?
Well, interestingly, the old AAUP, the one, our grandparents' AAUP, in 1970 changed its rules. It originally it had said anytime you introduce politically irrelevant material into a class, you have really violated the principles of the class. However, the AAUP had to deal with some introductions of political material that were entirely ethically justified. So Martin Luther King is executed, JFK is executed, the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. The list is long. You faced your class the next morning. Often classes were canceled, but not always for the early morning. And you said, I can't give my chemistry lecture. I have got to talk about the fact that our president was killed. The greatest civil rights leader of our era was killed. And so you talked about that. So there had to be an opportunity to respond to political crisis. So they changed the rules and they used your wording. They said persistent intrusions of irrelevant material are unacceptable. So they actually and I thought that was a good distinction to allow a kind of safety valve when
Yeah.
faculty felt just overwhelmed by something. So when is persistence a problem? Well, it's a problem when anyone registers a complaint. A student registers a complaint, and at that point, the issue should be investigated by a faculty committee. Unfortunately, that raises the next problem. Think about those departments that have issued anti-Zionist statements and made them formal principles. It used to be that the first stage of investigation would be the department. Well, what good is that? I mean, if the department is in complete agreement with the faculty member, and they say, well, Frank's persistence in introducing anti-Zionism is one of the best things we've learned about this week. That's not going to be much good. So it has to be a multidisciplinary investigation. You have to be willing to interview students in the class, find out, establish the truth of that persistence, and then if it's recognized to be true, the first thing that happens is the faculty member, if it's a course that's relevant, they teach something else. If it's intrusion in an irrelevant course, they get a very stern warning. They get a stern warning that if it continues, the next step will be termination. The next step will be losing their job. You can't do that without a real investigation, without a serious hearing. They want a lawyer present. They should be able to have a lawyer present. They should have the right to question their accusers. They should get real due process. But, a lot of these complaints would survive due process. A lot would be quite demonstrable. And then I think if the faculty member, there has to be a consideration for termination. Another way a complaint could happen is from a colleague. Faculty colleagues are very reluctant to complain about one another's teaching. There's a kind of, well, I leave him alone, he'll leave me
Mhm.
alone. Let's bury our heads in the sand. And that's been generally the case for a long time that debates about one another's pedagogy have not been part of the reality of the academy. Debates about publications, yes. Debates about teaching, no. I think debates about teaching have to be part of the academic scene. We have to be willing to talk frankly about these problems and talk about one another's practices. of course, it makes us all feel vulnerable, but I see no correction to this problem otherwise. And then there's yet one more thing, which is that uh, when you have disciplines, because remember I said that anti-Zionist disciplinary positions began to be the case in 2013. From 2013 to 2015, the first academic disciplines said Israel is a racist country, Israel is an anti-Zionist country. So they took those stands for the discipline as a whole. That, that really means that you need some expertise and some willingness to think about other disciplines from the campus as a whole. So I know they don't want to do it, but physics professors need to learn a little bit about what English professors say. English professors don't need to know so much about physics professors because that's not where the problem is. The problem is really in a range of humanities and social science disciplines and departments, the departments that represent those disciplines locally. And there needs to be responsibility for those disciplines in departments that would prefer to bury their heads in the sand. Now, I talk to a lot of people in STEM fields and in medicine, in part because I co-organize a faculty group on University of Illinois campuses, both campuses, called Faculty for Academic Freedom and Against Anti-Semitism. And we started this in February. We now have 90 members, which is a pretty good start, especially since people are afraid to join. And we don't have members from humanities departments. I mean, I'm an emeritus English professor, so we have an English department member more or less, but we don't have them, and we have an emeritus history department member. So we have several emeriti from those fields, but from the humanities fields, we don't have, actual continuing faculty, which is a pretty pretty stark evidence of where the problems are. And the disciplines and departments that show the problems, there needs to be a conversation campus-wide about what needs to be done with those departments. In some cases, they shouldn't be able to hire independently. There should be multi-departmental groups that do the hiring. And in the worst cases, they don't do any hiring until enough of them die out to be able to restart the program. And it does require a generation moving on. There are some very distinguished institutions that have taken that option. Many, many years ago, the Harvard decided that its English department was deliberately doing second-rate hiring. They took away hiring powers from the English department. Because it was Harvard, they appointed a distinguished group of national faculty. They didn't just look locally, they looked nationally for people to do the English department's hiring. Maybe the University of Illinois would not be able to pull that off, but they might indeed be able to. So if Harvard could face the music about one of its core departments, there really is no reason why the rest of us can't do that.
Good. Let me ask you this. I recently read that Cornell professor Eric Chaffetz, who accuses Israel of running a concentration camp and poisoning water supplies, is going to teach a course next year entitled Gaza, Ingenuity and Resistance. And what are your thoughts about courses where it seems plain that the professor is preaching his point of view rather than objectively examining reality?
I actually was in contact with Eric quite a bit some years ago because of his work in Native American studies. I was defending a group of Native American faculty in Oklahoma who'd run into difficulty, and I went out and visited with him and worked with him for quite a number of months. And Eric was one of the people I consulted because in that area, it seemed to me he had demonstrable expertise. Um, Demonstrable expertise on Israel, I'm afraid I never encountered in Eric's person. Now, perhaps he's, gone through major character change since then and, took an Israel pill and has learned about it. So I would want to be sure that Eric really has some expertise in Israel before he teaches that course. Now, my assumption is his department is all in favor of it, right? So my guess, I mean, I haven't investigated, but I would expect the department is fine with that. And so that means that the department is not going to be a very good policing entity for what's happening with that course. The if he was in an area, if he had established expertise and had been teaching the subject matter and began more and more teaching it in a hostile way, because that happens to people. That is, we've had people who weren't anti-Zionist 20 years ago, but who are anti-Zionist now and who've changed their attitudes. So when you have that, when you have an expert who suddenly becomes a very hostile, quote, expert, then I think academia really has only one real way of combating it, which is to make sure that the curriculum as a whole, not in that department necessarily, but in the university as a whole, offers strong course offerings with an alternative point of view. That is, the university as a whole has a responsibility to offer a balanced curriculum. If there's nobody to teach a fact-based course on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, then you've got to hire somebody. You've got to make it a priority. And that has to be a campus responsibility. So compensating against that course might be a real challenge. I mean, it might be the only easy way to do it. However, if you really feel that that Chaffetz is making what amount to anti-Semitic accusations, running a concentration camp is, I guess, a judgment value. That is, if you decide that Gaza is an open air concentration camp, well, it's a concentration camp where you can take a fishing boat out into the open. It's a concentration camp where you can, establish a religious institution where you run universities such as they are. I'm not fond of, haven't been fond of Gaza universities, and I'm not, suffering any crocodile tears about the idea that they should be rebuilt on different principles than they've had. But there are debatable but very hostile propositions, and there are propositions that represent real lies. So poisoning water supplies, which is one that you mentioned, the problem is that's a lie. And that really can justify a university investigation, and it could involve serious warnings and a serious sanction if it continues. And I have some experience with sanctions here at the University of Illinois. I won't mention the discipline, but there was a faculty member who was sanctioned by being refused a salary raise. And he was refused a salary raise for 15 years. Um, Believe me, that began to hurt. By the end, he was down pretty much at the level of a science teaching assistant. So even what sounds like not a fatal sanction can provide a pretty good lesson for that faculty member and for the campus as a whole. So there are sanctions less than termination, which I think send a pretty strong warning to the campus as a whole. And sanctions like that are very much worth considering if someone persists in unacceptable activity. But so I would distinguish in the case of someone like Chaffetz between debatable propositions versus actual demonstrable lies. If you want to debate whether Israel is an apartheid state, I think you can debate it rationally. I mean, I think you can show arguments, as I have, why that just isn't true. You can test the arguments that make it as a claim. And that's something you can stage within the academic environment, and you can stage it in an academic way. Poisoning the water supply, how do you have a debate about that, right? I mean, how do you have a debate about an invented claim, a hallucinatory claim? There's no debate. Prove that they don't do it, right? Well, no one dies from drinking the water. Well, who knows? I mean, it's beyond the powers of reason to adjudicate some accusations, and I think those deserve investigation and sanctions.
Let me pose another question here. In a recent article, Greg Lukianoff, the president of FIRE, wrote, I'll quote, "Higher education created this problem by favoring applicants who are interested only or primarily in engaging in activism. Indeed, they made activism a part of their marketing and recruiting materials. Right now, many students enroll with a predetermined moral and political certainty and intolerance for dissent, and schools largely encourage and reinforce it." Would you agree with Greg's assessment?
Well, there are some schools that really put social justice mission and activism in support of that mission front and center in their public materials, and then also in their recruitment decisions about who to bring in and who not to bring in. And that applies both to undergraduate admissions and to graduate admissions. And actually, it also applies to faculty searches. So once you really declare um, an activist social justice mission as your central raison d'etre, I mean, my sister campus, the University of Illinois at Chicago, has a social justice mission as its central declaration. And it's when they adopted it quite some years ago, it seemed like there were rational reasons for it. Chicago is, certainly amongst northern cities, the most segregated major city in the United States. And there is serious housing discrimination, employment discrimination, and they felt we're here in Chicago, we're a public institution, we should serve the city in which we live, we should serve the city in which we reside. So it made sense. But then it had all of these consequences. And the consequences included a kind of emphasis on student recruitment, faculty recruitment, putting those political values front and center in judging the people whose admission and hiring you wanted to emphasize. And it played out in departments. So the mission was a kind of a guidepost for departmental practices. And I think there are problems with that there are problems with the consequences of that at the campus. It's made, if you decide that your mission is to support the Palestinians over the Israelis, then you end up creating a hostile environment for Jewish or Israeli students. And that's part of what's happened on that campus. I mean, I was part of affirmative action moves on my own campus in the 70s and 80s, and they worked pretty well. Um, for one thing, of course, in the humanities, there were a lot when we were hiring faculty, which is what I was doing. Um, there were lots of women candidates. And so if we simply, you know, put a blinder on and said we want to hire the best person, often that person was a woman. We never had to prioritize gender-based hiring. We just tried to find the person who did the best possible work. Sometimes it was a woman, sometimes it wasn't, but we did plenty of female hiring as a result, all based on merit. The university introduced an interesting program, which was when you were on a committee, hiring committee, I chaired quite a number of them. I like to do that work. I really loved it. Very exciting to be seriously involved in hiring faculty. When we encountered a really first-rate African American candidate, we could instantly, with approval, initiate a separate hiring for that person. We removed them from the general search and hired them separately, and the general search persisted with no prioritizing of minority candidates. And every single Black candidate that we hired, because I can now look back 20, 25 years later, every single candidate had a distinguished publishing career, published several books, won awards for their teaching and research, and we lost half of them. We lost half of them because they went to Harvard or Yale. They eventually got offered prestige jobs at Ivy League schools, and we lost them. We never hired a single minority candidate who proved to be anything other than absolutely first rate. So we had those we had merit-based affirmative action hiring in the sense that, we just hired plenty of women because they were good. And we had a way of specially hiring minority candidates, and it worked pretty well. What we now have is the imposition of these DEI regulations that enforce that kind of hiring and enforce bias on our faculty committees, on our admissions committees, on our hiring committees, and this awful requirement that to apply for a job, you should have to have an affirmative statement about DEI in your file, which I think is a violation of academic freedom. I'm completely opposed to it. I mean, I spent decades doing research on minority poets. My field was poetry, minority poets and women poets. I did that because I thought some of the poetry was terrific, and that we were impoverishing our cultural history by not giving equal attention to first-rate poems by women and minorities. And I did the same thing working by merit when I taught Holocaust poetry, which I did a number of times. I always gave my students this assignment. I would say, of the poems we've read so far, what are the three worst Holocaust poems? What do you think are the Holocaust poems that are no bloody good? And we ran a contest for it through the semester. Now, my colleagues thought that was really disrespectful, but I felt that for a Holocaust poem to matter, it had to be a powerful poem that was of aesthetically high caliber. And so we had this contest. I did it for graduate students, did it for undergraduates, and it was it was an unconventional thing to do. But I just did not take the position that every Holocaust poem should be taken seriously and should be treated as a sacred object. I thought merit had to control the game. I'm a believer in that principle, not in blind recruitment based on political belief or race or gender. I think you can do a really good job and you can have a wonderfully diverse faculty by using a merit-based standard.
Thank you, Cary. Many colleges, as you know, have aggressive student groups that are pressing the boycott, sanction, and divest agenda aimed at Israel. Suppose you were advising a college president who's facing such demands. What would you say?
Well, first of all, we start with membership. I mean, there are many Jewish students, many Zionist students who have long and deep commitments to a whole range of causes. It may be reproductive rights, it may be climate change. In the last few years, we've increasingly seen student groups devoted to causes like that, declaring that they don't want these Zionists stepping inside the front door. They've tried to block Zionists from their membership. So I think colleges need to make an absolute prohibition against that kind of political litmus test and defund those groups. If they persist in that, they should be rapidly defunded. They should lose their status as recognized groups. In other words, they shouldn't even be recognized groups if they're defunded. They simply should not be recognized, which means they can't reserve space on campus. They can't hold a demonstration. They can't propose a resolution to student government. Whole series of rights should be taken away from them. I think that colleges should have an absolute prohibition against academic boycotts. If students groups want to propose an academic boycott, sure. They can propose a funded trip to Mars if they want to. I mean, they can propose anything they want and they can debate it, so be it. But an academic institution should make it clear that under no circumstances will an academic boycott be adopted. And so you can just, if you think that's what you're doing, trying to get the institution to actually support an academic boycott, then just know that, over our dead bodies is about the stand that you would take. And I think when there are proposals for academic boycotts, the business college on my own campus, the last time there was an academic boycott, a divestment proposal, the business college said, well, whether or not this divestment proposal succeeds or fails, what we're going to do is start even more cooperation programs with Israel. We already have some, we're going to start more. That was a great response to the student debate, learning that there's going to be more cooperation with Israeli universities now that you've had this debate. So I think sometimes a proactive response is just to do the very reverse of what the students are demanding. And I think on divestment as a whole, I mean, there actually has been some good things written in the last 6 months or more about how, in practical terms, divestment is really quite silly and maybe even impossible. Boeing does some weapons development. It's a big company. I'm not sure how happy I am about their airplanes anymore, but they manufacture airplanes. So you want to divest from Boeing because you don't like weapons development. They make other products. They're better known for their aircraft than they are for weapons development. So divesting from weapons manufacturers means it's a more complex matter than it might seem. There's a long history, and I've written about the effort to divest from weapons manufacturers in Israel, and also to divest from any kind of relationship with Israeli universities that do military research. Well, if you actually look at the military, quote, military research that a lot of universities do, it's a little bit amusing. For example, there was one university in Israel that had a contract to develop better boots for the IDF. So they developed better boots for the IDF, the Israeli military force, defense force. But then, of course, the company realized that maybe other people would like to buy those boots. So soon after the boots were marketed to the military, they were in shoe stores all over the country. They became just a commercial product for civilians. They began as military, but they soon were thereafter. An Israeli university developed better protective glasses for the military. And lo and behold, pretty soon, the better glasses were in drugstores. And of course, every every university that does medical research related to war wounds and battlefield conditions, that medical research immediately is adopted to civilian uses. You know, uh, a better way of dealing with a wound from a grenade also turns out to be a better way of dealing with a wound from a car crash. So inevitably, same thing was true with the space program here. Medical devices developed for the space program in the United States soon found their ways into hospitals in the United States. So just a lot of reasons why divestment proposals are really messy. A clear line between the companies that you would profit that you would divest from and the companies that you would deal with in daily life ain't so easy. Caterpillar, which is an Illinois company, so I know it well, is always listed amongst the companies to divest from because they have armored tractors that are used to demolish buildings in Gaza. I mean, in the West Bank. Now, I happen to think those building demolitions are a really bad idea. I'm opposed to them. I think punishing families that have a terrorist member is a really problematic thing. However, Caterpillar mostly builds tractors for the fields in the US and elsewhere. Most of its tractors are used in farming, not on the West Bank. So you're going to break your relationship with Caterpillar because some of its tractors are used there. Meanwhile, Caterpillar hires lots of ordinary people in its factories in the state of Illinois. So you're going to divest from Caterpillar and try to do damage to its ordinary workers in the state. So the consequences of divestment proposals kind of multiply, and the ethics of divestment becomes incredibly complicated and stupid quite rapidly. Finally, we haven't yet had an American Board of Trustees thinking that it's going to cede its responsibilities to a bunch of undergraduates. I mean, what other responsibilities you want to turn over to them? I mean, they're not capable of making investment decisions. That's not where the responsibilities for investment decisions lie. Academic boycotts, the AEUP was very clear about in 2006. They are an assault on the basic principles that ideas should be exchanged across borders without restrictions, that all people working in all science, technical, and humanistic fields should be able to be in dialogue with all other people in those fields. That's how we pursue the truth collectively across the planet. And to try to undermine that is to undermine the basic principles of academic freedom. You can't do both. You can't have academic boycotts and believe you're still honoring academic freedom. And the AEUP is just being dishonest and disingenuous in thinking that you can.
Thanks for that. We have just a little bit of time left, so I'll go to a question from the audience regarding the AAUP. And the person writes, the AAUP had a piece in Inside Education, Inside Higher Ed this week, wherein they claimed that they didn't endorse boycotts, just the right of people to call for them. Is this a distinction without a difference?
Well, that was a strategy that I must say really pissed me off. That was the piece that you're mentioning is by Joan Scott, who reiterates that stand. Look, when the AEUP, when I was president, issued in 2006 its comprehensive, absolute position against academic boycotts, it states right in there that, of course, individuals can still choose to participate in academic boycotts and can still honor them. It's there in black letter AAUP law that you, as an individual faculty member, student, whatever, have every right to honor not to have any relationships with Israeli universities, not to collaborate with them in any way. That's what you want, you can do it. the document is opposed to organized group boycotts that really do harm to institutions and to academic freedom. The AUP made it clear at the time that there's no desire whatsoever to restrict your individual decision making. And now the AUP turns around and says, what we're really trying to do is protect your individual decision making and your individual right to approve a boycott. When that's exactly what the AUP did in 2006. So, I mean, Joan Scott's just lying. She's a smart woman. I mean, she ought to be able to try to make arguments that are sound based on reason, based on nothing more than a lie. And, of course, Greg Lukianoff, the head of FIRE, in his response, which I think just came out yesterday, maybe yesterday or this morning, basically said she's lying. He said the same thing that I have. And, there it is.
Well, Cary Nelson, thank you very much. We've come to the end of our time allotted for the webinar. We greatly appreciate your eagerness to speak with us, and I'm looking forward to your next book. Please make sure that you let me know when it's going to be available.
I think you can guarantee that.
Thanks very much. And thanks to everyone who participated in our webinar. Too bad we didn't have time for all of your questions, but that's the way it goes. So thank you very much on behalf of the Martin Center. This is George Leaf. Thank you to Cary Nelson. And we'll see you again for our next webinar sometime early next year. Thank you very much.